The envelope in my hands felt heavier than paper should, weighted down by the gravity of what lay inside. It was the closing disclosure for the house, a charming colonial on the north side of town, complete with the wraparound porch I had spent 40 years dreaming about. My name wasn't on the deed, of course. Marcus had explained that with his smooth, persuasive cadence, the one he had perfected as a sales representative, the one that made you feel like you were the most important person in the world while he was picking your pocket. He said it was better for the financing if it was just him and Tara, but it was my money, $25,000, the entirety of my retirement nest egg, the result of skipping vacations, buying generic brands, and wearing the same winter coat for a decade. I sat at the small, scratch laminate table in the kitchen of my rental apartment. The fluorescent light overhead hummed with a dying flicker, casting long, pale shadows across the documents. I was trembling. It wasn't the tremor of age, though at 72, my hands weren't as steady as they used to be. This was a vibration that started in the marrow of my bones, a frequency of pure, unadulterated heartbreak. The hallway leading to the bedrooms was dark, but the door to the guest room, which Marcus and Tara were currently using while their lease transition happened, was slightly ajar. A sliver of golden light spilled out across the worn carpet. Sound carries in these old buildings, traveling through the vents and under the doors with cruel clarity. I hadn't meant to listen. I had just gotten up to get a glass of water to swallow my blood pressure medication. But then I heard the laughter. It was Marcus. He had a deep, rolling laugh that used to make my heart swell with pride. It was the sound of my boy, the boy I had raised alone after his father walked out when he was 3. Now that laugh sounded sharp, almost metallic. Tara was speaking now. Her voice was high and breathless with excitement. She was saying that she could not believe it was finally happening. She said the keys would be in their hands by Friday. I took a step closer, the floorboard creaking slightly under my slipper, but they were too engrossed in their celebration to notice. I heard Marcus say that everything was set, and the wire transfer had cleared. He told her that the house was officially theirs. The house was theirs, not ours. Theirs. Tara asked the question that stopped my heart in my chest. She asked if he had told me yet. She asked if Evelyn knew the plan. I leaned against the wall, the cool plaster pressing against my cheek. I needed support. The world was tilting on its axis. Marcus let out a sigh, the sound of a man burdened by an inconvenience. He said he hadn't told me. He said he was waiting for the right moment. He told his wife that he didn't want to deal with the drama right now. He said that if he told me now, I would make the whole moving week about me and my feelings. Tara giggled. It was a cruel, conspiratorial sound. She said that at least her mother, Mrs. Galloway, was already packed. She said her mother was so excited about the suite. She said the garden view from the downstairs bedroom was going to be perfect for her mother's watercolor painting. The air left my lungs. The downstairs bedroom, the master suite on the first floor, the one with the bay windows overlooking the backyard azaleas, the room Marcus had promised me. I remembered the conversation so vividly it felt like a physical blow. It was 6 months ago. Marcus had sat in this very kitchen, holding my hand, looking at me with those big brown puppy dog eyes. He had told me that I wouldn't be alone anymore. He had said that this house would be a sanctuary for the whole family. He had explicitly described how I would have the downstairs suite so I wouldn't have to deal with stairs as I got older. He had said, "Mama, you take care of the down payment, and we will take care of you for the rest of your life." Now I stood in the hallway and listened to him rewrite history. Marcus told Tara that Mrs. Galloway was more help with the kids anyway. He said that having her in the house made more sense. He said that his mother, meaning me, was getting difficult. He said I was needy. He said I hovered too much. He said it was better if I stayed in my apartment. He said I was used to being alone, so it wouldn't be a big change for me. Used to being alone. The words were like ice shards in my veins. I was used to being alone because I worked 2 jobs to put him through college. I was used to being alone because I never dated again after his father left, fearing a stepfather might treat him poorly. I was used to being alone because every spare moment and every spare dollar went into ensuring Marcus had the life I never did. Tara chimed in, her voice dripping with false sympathy. She said maybe they could help me find a cheaper apartment eventually. She said the rent in my current place was going up, and if I downsized to a studio in a senior living facility, I would save money. She said it was for my own good, for my own good. They were discussing putting me out to pasture in a studio apartment while her mother lived in the luxury I had paid for. I couldn't listen anymore. I felt bile rising in my throat. I backed away slowly, careful not to make a sound. I retreated into the kitchen and sat back down at the table. The papers lay there, mocking me. The numbers on the page blurred as tears finally welled up in my eyes. But they weren't just tears of sadness. As they fell, hitting the cheap vinyl tablecloth, they felt hot. They were tears of rage. I sat there for 10 minutes, staring at the wall, listening to the murmurs of their continued planning. They were discussing furniture placement. They were debating whether to paint the dining room eggshell or cream. They were building a future on the foundation of my sacrifice, and I was not included in the blueprints. The door to the guest room opened. Heavy footsteps approached the kitchen. I quickly wiped my face with my sleeve and grabbed the electric bill, pretending to study it intensely. Marcus walked in. He was wearing his expensive silk pajamas, another luxury I couldn't afford. He looked at me and smiled, that dazzling, boyish smile that had been my weakness for 34 years. He asked what I was doing up so late. He asked if everything was okay. I looked at him. I really looked at him. For the first time, I didn't see my baby boy. I didn't see the toddler who used to cling to my leg when it thundered. I saw a stranger. I saw a man who was capable of looking his mother in the eye and lying without blinking. I kept my voice steady, forcing a calmness I did not feel. I told him I was just looking over some bills. I asked him if the closing documents were all in order. He walked over to the fridge and grabbed a bottle of organic juice. My juice, which I bought as a treat for myself. He took a swig directly from the bottle. He said yes, everything was perfect. He said the lawyer gave the green light. He said we, meaning him and Tara, were all set for the big day. I nodded. I asked him, casually, about the moving logistics. I asked if he needed help packing my things for the downstairs suite. The silence that followed was brief, but it screamed volumes. Marcus froze with the bottle halfway to his mouth. He blinked. Then, the mask slid back into place. He cleared his throat. He said that we needed to talk about that. He said that he and Tara had been looking at the layout of the house again. He said they were worried that the construction in the neighborhood might be too loud for me. He said they were thinking it might be too stressful for me to move right away. He suggested that maybe I stay here for a few months, just until they got settled. He didn't mention Mrs. Galloway. He didn't mention that the room was already promised to someone else. He just kicked the can down the road, hoping I was too old or too stupid to notice. I forced a smile. It felt like stretching cracked leather. I told him I understood. I told him that made sense. He looked relieved. He patted my shoulder, a condescending tap. Tap, tap. He said I was the best mom in the world. He said he knew I would understand. Then he yawned, stretched, and said he was going back to bed. When he left the room, the silence rushed back in, heavier than before. I was alone in the kitchen with the hum of the refrigerator and the ruin of my expectations. That night, sleep was an impossibility. I lay in my narrow bed, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a weeping eye. Memories flooded my mind, not the warm, fuzzy ones, but the ones I had suppressed. The red flags I had painted white because I wanted to believe in my son. I remembered the time he needed a car for his first job. I took out a loan. He promised to make the payments. He made 2. I paid the rest. I remembered the time Tara needed dental surgery and they didn't have insurance. I emptied my emergency fund, $7,000. They never mentioned paying it back. I remembered the credit card debt, the investment opportunity that turned out to be a pyramid scheme, the bail money when he got into a bar fight in his 20s. I got up at 4 a.m. The darkness outside was absolute, the rain hammering against the window pane like a demand. I went to the kitchen and made a pot of coffee, strong and black. I pulled out a fresh notepad from the junk drawer. This wasn't for a grocery list. I sat down and started to write. I titled the page, "The Cost of Love." I began to catalog the last 5 years. My memory, usually sharp, felt razor-edged tonight. Item 1, the Chevy Malibu, $4,500. Item 2, Tara's dental work, $7,200. Item 3, the bail and lawyer fees, $3,000. Item 4, the loan for their wedding venue deposit, $5,000. Item 5, monthly cell phone bills I was still paying for both of them, $180 a month for 60 months, $10,800. Item 6, the down payment for the house, $25,000. I did the math. The numbers danced before my eyes, stark and undeniable. Total $55,500, $55,500. That was more than money. That was my life. That was thousands of hours sitting in a cubicle typing reports. That was the trip to Italy I never took. That was the knee surgery I kept putting off. That was my dignity. And in return, I was difficult. I was needy. I was to be left behind in a crumbling apartment while Mrs. Galloway painted watercolors in my sunroom. As the sun began to rise, casting a gray, watery light over the kitchen, a steel rod stiffened in my spine. It was a sensation I hadn't felt in years. It was the feeling of a door closing and locking. I waited until 8 a.m. Marcus and Tara were still asleep. They always slept late, even on weekdays, claiming they were not morning people. I dressed in my best suit, a navy blue ensemble I usually saved for funerals. I applied my lipstick with precision. I put on my raincoat and grabbed my umbrella. I walked out of the apartment without leaving a note. My first stop was the bank. The branch manager, Mr. Henderson, knew me well. He had been the one to process the wire transfer for the $25,000 just 3 weeks ago. He smiled when I walked in, but his smile faltered when he saw the expression on my face. I sat across from his mahogany desk and placed my hands flat on the cool surface. I told him I needed to make some immediate changes to my accounts. Mr. Henderson asked how he could help. I told him I wanted to revoke Marcus's power of attorney. I told him I wanted to remove Marcus as the beneficiary on my life insurance policy. I told him I wanted to close my current checking account, the one Marcus had access to, for emergencies, and open a new one solely in my name at a different branch. Mr. Henderson looked concerned. He asked if everything was all right. He asked if I was under duress. I looked him in the eye and told him I had never been more clear-headed in my life. I told him that I was simply restructuring my assets to reflect my current reality. He processed the paperwork. The sound of the stamp hitting the paper was the most satisfying sound I had heard in years. Thud, thud, thud. Each impact felt like a chain breaking. My next stop was the law office of Sarah Jenkins. She was an old friend from my church, a sharp-witted woman who specialized in estate planning. I hadn't made an appointment, but when the receptionist saw my face, she squeezed me in. Sarah sat me down and offered me tea. I declined. I didn't want tea. I wanted justice. I explained the situation. I told her about the house, the promise, the phone call, the betrayal. Sarah listened without interrupting. She took notes, her pen scratching furiously across the legal pad. When I finished, she looked up, and her eyes were fierce. She said that what they had done wasn't just morally bankrupt, it was financial exploitation. She asked if I wanted to sue for the return of the down payment. I thought about it. A lawsuit would take years. It would be ugly. It would destroy any shred of relationship that remained. I told her no. I told her I didn't want the money back. I considered it a severance package, the price of my freedom. But I wanted to ensure they never got another cent. I wanted to change my will. We spent the next hour drafting a New Testament. In the previous version, Marcus got everything, In this new version, my assets, meager as they might be after the house theft, would go to the local women's shelter, specifically for a fund to help older women who had been victims of financial abuse. I left Sarah's office feeling lighter, as if a physical weight had been lifted from my shoulders. It was noon. Usually, I would go home and make lunch for everyone because Marcus and Tara forgot to buy groceries. Not today. I walked into a bistro on Main Street. It was a place I had always walked past, thinking it was too fancy, too expensive. I asked for a table for one by the window. I ordered the lobster bisque and a glass of Chardonnay. I sat there watching the rain streak the glass, eating my soup. It was delicious, rich, creamy, and hot. For the first time in decades, I was taking care of Evelyn. My phone began to buzz. It was Marcus, then Tara, then Marcus again. "Mama, where are you? Evelyn, are you okay? We woke up and you were gone. Mama, answer the phone. We need to talk about the movers." I watched the notifications pop up on the screen and then fade away. I didn't reach for the phone. I took another sip of wine. I let them wait. I let them worry. For the first time, their urgency was not my emergency. I returned to the apartment at 4 p.m. The rain had stopped, leaving the world looking scrubbed and raw. When I walked in, the atmosphere in the apartment was thick with tension. Marcus was pacing the living room. Tara was sitting on the sofa, looking annoyed rather than worried. Marcus spun around when he saw me. He threw his hands in the air. He asked where I had been. He said he had been calling me for hours. He said he was about to call the police. I closed the door behind me and locked it. I took off my raincoat and hung it up deliberately. I didn't look at him. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. He followed me, his voice rising. He said this was irresponsible. He said they had things to do. He said the movers were demanding a deposit for the extra truck they needed for Mrs. Galloway's piano, and he needed me to write a check for $3,000. I turned around slowly. I leaned against the counter and crossed my arms. I looked at my son. I looked at the man who thought I was nothing more than an ATM with a pulse. I said no. The word hung in the air, simple and absolute. Marcus blinked. He looked confused, as if I had started speaking a foreign language. He asked what I meant. He said he just needed a check. He promised he would pay me back next month when his bonus came in. I laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. I told him to stop. I told him I knew about the bonus. I knew there was no bonus. I knew there was never a bonus. Tara stood up from the couch and walked into the kitchen. Her face was tight. She asked what was getting into me. She said I was acting strange. She said maybe I was having a cognitive episode. I looked at her. I saw the cruelty behind her eyes, the calculation. I told her my cognitive faculties were perfectly fine. In fact, they were better than they had been in years. I told them I heard them last night. The color drained from Marcus's face. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I told them I heard every word. I heard about the in-law suite that was really for Mrs. Galloway. I heard about how I was difficult. I heard about the plan to shuffle me off to a studio apartment. Marcus started to stammer. He tried to deny it. He said I misunderstood. He said they were just brainstorming. He tried to use that charm, that weaponized affection. He reached out to touch my arm. I stepped back. I told him not to touch me. I told him that for 34 years I had lived for him. I told him about the shoes I didn't buy, the trips I didn't take, the life I didn't live so that he could have everything. I told him about the $5,500. I pulled the notepad from my purse and slammed it onto the table. The list of debts stared up at them. I told him that the $25,000 for the house was a gift, a final gift. I told him to keep it. I told him to enjoy the house. I told him I hoped Mrs. Galloway enjoyed the garden view. But, I continued, my voice dropping to a whisper that was louder than any scream, the bank is closed. I told him there would be no check for the movers. There would be no check for the piano. There would be no more loans for cars or teeth or bad investments. I told him I had been to the bank. I told him I had been to the lawyer. Marcus looked terrified. For the first time, he wasn't looking at his mother. He was looking at a woman he had underestimated. He asked what I did at the lawyer's office. I told him that was none of his business. Tara started to cry. It was a performance. Tears on demand. She said they couldn't afford the move without my help. She said they would lose the deposit. She said I was ruining everything. I looked at her and felt nothing. The well of sympathy I had drawn from for so long was dry. I told her that sounded like a problem for the homeowners to solve. I pointed to the door. I told them I wanted them out of my apartment. I told them they had until the weekend to move their things out of the guest room. If they weren't gone by Sunday, I would change the locks and donate their belongings to the Salvation Army. Marcus stared at me. He looked small. He looked like a child who had broken a vase and realized finally that it couldn't be glued back together. He asked quietly, "Mama, but we're family. You're my mother." I looked at him, and my heart broke one last time. It cracked open, hot and painful, but underneath the pain was clarity. I told him yes, I was his mother, and because I was his mother, I had to teach him the hardest lesson of all. I had to teach him that people are not resources to be consumed. I had to teach him that love is not a transaction. I told him to leave. They left. It took them an hour to pack their overnight bags. They shouted, they pleaded, they cried. I sat in my chair by the window and watched the street. When they finally walked out the door, the slam echoed through the building. I was alone. But this silence was different. It wasn't the silence of abandonment, it was the silence of peace. The next few weeks were hard. Marcus sent texts ranging from angry diatribes to pathetic apologies. I didn't block him, he was still my son, but I didn't reply. I let his words accumulate like digital dust. I joined a book club at the library. I started taking a watercolor class. Ironically, something I had always wanted to do but never had the time for. I met a woman named Lydia there. She was a retired teacher, widow, sharp as a tack. We started going for walks in the park on Tuesdays. One afternoon, 6 months later, I was sitting on a park bench with Lydia. The autumn leaves were turning, a brilliant explosion of gold and crimson. The air was crisp. Lydia asked me if I ever heard from them. I nodded. I told her Marcus called sometimes. He sounded tired. He and Tara were having financial trouble. The house was more expensive to maintain than they thought. Mrs. Galloway was, apparently, quite demanding and didn't contribute to the bills. Lydia asked if I was going to help them. I watched a young mother pushing a stroller down the path. She stopped to fix the baby's blanket, kissing the child's forehead with that fierce, consuming love that only a mother knows. I looked back at Lydia and smiled. I told her no. I told her that I had already helped him. I gave him life. I gave him an education, and I gave him a house. But now I was giving him something more valuable. I was giving him the dignity of standing on his own 2 feet. And I was giving myself the dignity of sitting here in the sun, enjoying the autumn of my life without the weight of a grown man on my back. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of fallen leaves and rain and freedom. I realized then that family isn't just about blood. It isn't about obligation. It's about mutual respect. It's about reciprocity. I had spent a lifetime building a home for others, tearing pieces of myself away to patch the holes in their lives. Now finally I was building a home inside myself. I was not a victim. I was not a difficult old woman. I was Evelyn Vance. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. "Come on," I said to Lydia, standing up and brushing a leaf from my coat. "Let's go get some coffee, my treat." We walked away together under the canopy of golden trees, leaving the long shadows behind us.